Hi there, welcome to PaperSource's virtual quilling workshop. My name is Rebecca. I am head of DIY at PaperSource and I'm going to teach you how to quill. So first off, we're going to start by learning some of the basics. I'll show you how to create different scroll and coil shapes and get some practice there. And then once we do that, we'll start some projects. So we'll create a quilled monogram. I'll show you how to create the edge work and then fill that in with the quilled shapes. And then in addition to that, we'll also make some floral stationery. So let's get started. Here's what you'll find in your Quilling Creativity subscription box. You will have quilling strips in all different colors, angled tweezers, and a quilling tool, detail scissors, glue that has a broad applicator and then a detail tip, cards and envelopes for making stationery. Colors may vary, a box mailer to send your quilled art in, cardstock for larger pieces, and then a quilling primer template to practice different shapes on. So the quilling tool that comes in your box includes two different ends and then an extra bit that you can actually put into a drill for motorized quilling. For the sake of this video, we're going to focus on the hand tool. So when you open your packs of quilling strips, you will notice that the ends are glued together. This is to help you store the strips in between use. So when you're ready to use one of them, you can just simply pull it away from the glued ends. And if you want a color that's in the middle, you can just simply split apart the paper and pull it out from the glued end. So in addition to buying quilling strips, you can actually make your own really easily. So I'm going to show you how to do that. You can basically just start with a kind of lightweight paper. I don't use cardstock because it's a little too heavy. So this text weight paper that we have at PaperSource is perfect for quilling. And it's also a great way to use up your scrap paper. I like to think of quilling almost as an eco-craft because it's a great way for me to reuse all of this instead of throwing it away. So I'm going to show you. What you'll need is a paper trimmer. I prefer the guillotine style. It has the blade that raises and lowers like this. And then you want one that has measurements all along this top fence here. And then you can just kind of follow the ruler guide to create your strips. And typically I create strips that are about an 1/8 inch wide. If I'm not going to mail it, I would go up to maybe a 1/4 inch. Maybe it's a piece of art you want to frame on the wall. You want something that pops out a little bit more, so you could go to a 1/4 inch. But in this case, I'm going to do an 1/8 inch. So you just slide your paper until you've moved it 1/8 of an inch. Make sure you kind of hold it down so it doesn't move. In this case, I've got a guard here that presses down, and then you just cut. And now you've got a quilling strip. So it's really easy to just kind of keep going and make a bunch of strips this way. And that way this paper doesn't end up in the recycling bin or the garbage. And there you have it. So once you take your quilling tool out of the packaging, you can just simply slide the two ends together. This end is the main end that we'll be focusing on. There's a little slot in the center here where you can slide in paper for easy quilling. And there's also a pointed end which can help you when you're assembling pieces to kind of move things around or scrape up extra glue, etc. So to start out with, I'm going to show you how to use your quilling tool. So you're going to start on the end where there's the little slot, and that's where we're going to slide a strip of paper in. I'm going to slide it in till it stops and can't go any further. And then I'm going to pull in this end of the paper so it's tucked inside and it's not sticking out the other end. So I'm gonna start spinning the quilling tool with my dominant hand, and I'm just kind of steadying the quilling strip with my non-dominant hand and keeping it from moving up and down the end of the quilling tool. You want all of the coils of paper to line up one on top of the other and not to kind of go off to the side. And I'm holding the paper pretty tightly with my non-dominant hand. But you can change up how tightly you hold it when you quill. The tighter my non-dominant hand kind of holds it, the tighter the quilling will be. And the looser it is, then the looser the coil will be. So I'm just gonna keep spinning. And I'm gonna go all the way to the end for this example. But we're gonna move on to practicing different shapes. And sometimes we will coil the whole strip of paper and sometimes we'll just do part of it. So when you get to the end, one thing you wanna try not to do is kind of yank it off in the end in a way that twists the coil shape. So sometimes what I like to do is just release it a little bit and then gently pull it off the end. And there you have your first quilled shape. So the first step in learning how to coil is how to create different scroll and coil shapes. And these are then the building blocks to create little works of art. So we're going to use this template to practice on. And then I'm using half strips as well to practice with, which you're welcome to use full strips if you prefer. Using half strips can make your paper last a little longer. When it comes to scrolls and coils, one of the main differences there is coils are glued closed and scrolls are open-ended. And then both of those shapes have a lot of different variations. So let's get started. So I'm going to start with the V scroll, and the name really describes the shape. You're going to start by folding a strip in half to create a V. I'm going to try to make sure those sides are lined up pretty well. And from here, I'm going to coil each end kind of away from each other. So these two will be coiled in a different direction. So I'm going to start by sliding that in the end and then rolling it. And you could go all the way to the crease if you want a really kind of tighter coil, or if you want it to be a little bit more open and looser, you could stop before you reach that crease. So I'm going to stop about 1 inch away and just release that and slide it off the end. So you can see you have one side right there. Another way to approach this is you could kind of curve the paper ever so slightly before you start coiling if you want this side of the V scroll to have that little bit more of a curved shape, whereas this one is a little bit straighter. So we'll do each side differently. So I'm just going to repeat the rest and start to coil it. And I'm going to do the same thing where I stop about 1 inch away from the crease. Release. And there you have your V scroll. So it just looks like a little V with the curly ends. One thing with quilling is you can keep kind of playing with the shape of the paper even after you've used the quilling tool. So if I want this side to be a little bit more open and exaggerated, you can just kind of pull the coil a little looser. And if I decide I wanted that to be a little bit more rounded, I could kind of shape it with my hands as well to make that a little bit more rounded. So there's, it's really a little more free form than you'd expect. You can continue to kind of shape it with your hands. So that's the V scroll. So next I'm going to do a heart scroll, which starts out the same way as the V scroll with folding it in the center. But instead of coiling outwards, we're going to coil inwards. Of course, you can also make it more asymmetrical if you want to. You don't have to fold it in the middle like I just did. And I'm going to stop roughly the same spot, about an inch away from the fold. And then I'll go ahead and repeat on this side. And as you're practicing the different shapes on this template, feel free to experiment with how tightly you coil or how loosely, and you can kind of play around with proportions and just get really comfortable with it. So there is my heart scroll. So I made this one, whoops, a little asymmetrical, but again, you can kind of make it what you want it. So I'm just laying everything down first. A little later on, I'll show you how you can actually glue everything down. Next, we're going to do a C scroll. So again, the name describes the shape. It's going to be like a C. I like to prime the strip a little bit by curving it with my fingers. And from here, I'm going to coil inwards. I have a little bit of glue on the end of this strip that I did not pull off, but that's okay, it's just practice. So I'm going roughly halfway. It can be a little tricky to tell what halfway is as you're rolling it, but again, you could always play around with the shape afterwards if you want it to look a little different. And then I'm almost going to meet the two. And then there you have your C scroll. Again, you can kind of play with that shape if you want to, or leave it just as is. Now we're actually going to do some coil shapes. So this midsection, these are all coils, so that means they're closed. So we'll be starting by creating the coil and gluing it together and then playing around with the shape. So I'm actually going to jump to this spot here because this is the basic coil. So you can simply slide this in and you have to roll all the way to the end on this one. All right, and so I'm going to let this release. And so if you want a smaller coil, then you want to kind of hold it to prevent it from opening up more. If you want a bigger coil, then you wouldn't hold it, you'd let it keep releasing. You can also kind of play around with the pointed end if you want to stretch out the layers a little bit, if it's tighter than you wanted it. But I'm fine with that right there. I'm going to use this glue and this detail end. And I'm going to just gently pick up my coil. I try to hold it on the sides like this instead of crushing down the coil shape. And I'm just going to do a teeny little dab of glue on the ends. It's actually better to do less glue than more glue. The more glue you add, the more time it takes to dry. And sometimes that just makes it trickier to get it to stick. So I'm just pushing it down there, and I also like using the pointed end of my quilling tool to help coax that down a little bit. So when you've just used a little bit of glue, typically it doesn't take long, whoops, to take hold. So that's how you make a coil shape. So I'm just going to leave that one as is, just a simple circle coil. And then we're going to make a bunch more coils. And you always start with this basic circle. And you glue it together, and from there you change the shape with your fingers. So I'm gonna go ahead and make 5 more basic coils and get them all ready to go. And then once all 5 are made, then we'll change the shapes of them. Again, I'm just holding this gently on the sides, teeny little dab of glue, and then pressing it down. All right, 4 more to go. Okay, now that I have all my coils made, I'm going to go ahead and shape them with my hands to these different shapes. So first is the Marquee Shape, which is kind of like an eye shape. So what I do is I'm going to be pinching this with my fingers. I keep in mind where my seam is from where I glued down, and I tried to hide that in the creases. So I've got a seam right here, so I'm going to make that one of my pinch points. And then the other pinch point will be directly opposite. And so I like to kind of gently coax it at first so that I can spread out the coils however I want. And then I start pinching it a little bit more firmly to kind of lock in the shape. And you can make it more elongated if you want to, or less, but it's simply like that. Next is the Teardrop Shape, which is kind of like a one-sided marquee. So I'm just going to pinch one side. So again, I'm going to find that seam, and I'm going to kind of gently coax the coils, and then I'm going to kind of pinch more firmly. So one side is rounded here, and the other is pointed. So curved teardrop, you kind of start the same way, but then you'll start curving. So I'm finding that seam and I'm pinching, keeping the other side rounded. And then I start kind of bending this. And you can bend it with your hands. You could also use your quilling tool here to kind of wrap this around to create that curved shape. And you can make it more exaggerated, less exaggerated, however you want. Next, I'm going to do a square. So I kind of start out similar to the marquee, where I'm pinching opposite sides. And then I rotate it and get the other ones. And so you start to form that square shape. Like that. You can make the corners as sharp or as rounded as you want. Then we have the triangle. And here I kind of just press all of the corners at once, like this, to create that triangle shape. So there you have 6 different coil shapes, and there's really, you can just keep exploring. You can see how simple it is. You start with just your rounded coil, and then you shape them with your hands into all these different shapes. So the last row here, we're going to go back to some scroll shapes, starting with an S scroll. And again, the description really describes the shape of it. I like to kind of prime this one with my hands just to start to get that loose kind of S shape to guide me. And then I'm going to start on one end and coil towards the center. And kind of as I'm approaching the center is when I typically release it. And then we're going to switch to the other side and coil in the opposite direction. I'm gonna go up. I'm gonna just go ahead and meet that other one and then release it. So now you have this S shape. And again, you could kind of play around with how loose that is if you want to, or keep it tight. Now you have your S scroll. Same side scroll is a similar technique to V scroll, except instead of these going off in different directions, they're gonna arc in the same direction. I often like to fold this one a little bit more of an asymmetrical approach. And then I'm basically gonna coil them both in the same direction. So I'm gonna start with the shorter one. And I find myself using this one a lot to create really fluid organic shapes, whether I'm doing a more abstract design or if I'm doing florals. I find it is a great scroll shape for creating kind of vine-like elements in a floral design. So again, I'm just coiling this one in the same direction. And I'm not going all the way down to the bottom. And so now I have these two scrolls kind of arcing in the same direction. So for this last scroll, I'm actually going to use a full length quilling strip. So I'm going to set this shorter one aside. And this is one of the trickier ones on your primer, but it's a great one for filling up a lot of space really quickly with coils. So it's called Connected Scrolls because it has the effect of looking like multiple scrolls attached to each other. So we're going to start by creating multiple folds. So I'm going to fold it in half. And then I'm going to fold it in half again. And then I'm going to fold it one more time. So the amount of folds you do can vary. The shorter the strip, the fewer the folds. But with a long strip like this, you can get in more folds. So I'm going to unfold everything now. So these are basically little markers for where I'm going to start and stop my coiling. So everywhere there's a fold is where you're going to start a new scroll. And one thing to keep in mind is just to keep moving your quilling tool in the same direction for each coil that you do. And this can be a little confusing to watch because sometimes the paper starts flipping around a little bit. So I'll try to go slowly so it can make sense. So I'm going to start on that first fold, and I'm just coiling away from me, and it's pulling in both sides at the same time. And I'm going to go all the way until I hit that first fold, right about there. I'm going to release, and I'm going to go to the next one. And I'm still coiling in the same direction. Try to move that away. And again, it's pulling in paper from both sides. And I'm going to roll all the way until I get to the next fold, which is right about there. And you can go a little over it too if you want to. Sometimes it helps smooth out the crease. So just keep jumping ahead and keep quilling in the same direction to get this the right effect. All right, did I make it to the next crease? I think I did. So I'm going to go ahead and release that. And then I've made it to my last one. Still quilling in the same direction, and in this case I'll just go all the way to the end. And then I'm going to release. And so now what you have is this series of connected scrolls, and they're really flexible, so depending on a shape you might be trying to fill, you can kind of bunch them all together, or you can glue them down in more of like a running wave shape if you choose. But I like this for making quick work of filling a larger amount of space. If you have any little kinks that are still showing, then you could always smooth them out if they're going to show up in your work. Sometimes when you're pressing them together, it doesn't really make a difference. But again, feel free to go in with your hands, just like all the other shapes, and kind of smooth that out if you want. So now that we've practiced creating different coils and scrolls, I'm going to show you how you can glue your quilling work to the paper. So first of all, I have our tweezers, our glue, and then actually these two other things which help me glue. One is just this scrap of plastic. You might have a plastic plate or an old to-go container or something. And this is basically a surface I spread the glue on. And then I have this old rewards card that I sort of use as my glue squeegee, if you will. So I would just encourage you to find something like this from around the house to make the gluing even easier. So I'm going to start by spreading a little glue on here. And I'm actually going to use the detail end. I could use the broader applicator too, but I actually don't need too much glue, and as it dries, I like to refresh it. So I just have a little bit here, and then I'm going to use this to spread it to create a skim coat. So it's clear, so it's a little hard to see, but I have a really skim coat of glue here. And then what you're going to do is pick up your shape with the tweezers. I'm just going to grab this coil and drop it onto the glue and just kind of press that down so that all the edges are getting covered with glue. And then to release it, I like to loosen some of the coils before picking it up, just so I don't mess up the shape too much. And then you can go ahead and drop it down and just press it. And that's all it takes to glue down your quilling. If you ever glue something down and notice that you maybe missed a spot, you could always take a little piece of paper and just pick up the glue on one side and then slide it under the edge to get the surface glued down. So let me just maybe do an example here where I intentionally miss a spot. So I'll do this little curved teardrop. And I'll go ahead, glue that down. So now you can see this end is kind of wiggling free because I didn't get the glue there. So I'm going to go ahead and just make sure I get the glue on one side of this strip. Try not to drag my hand in that. And then you can kind of slide this underneath so that it gets the glue there, and then press down. So easy way to fix any spots that you missed. So now that you've learned how to do different scrolls and coil shapes, I'm going to show you how to do edge work. This is one example here. Essentially, whatever your design is going to be, whether it's a monogram or some other shape, you essentially create a border out of paper to contain that shape, which you can then fill with more quilling work. So we're going to practice edge work by creating a monogram. And one thing that can be helpful when you're doing edge work is having a template to work off of. It's not necessary, but if you find it helpful, you can use these letter templates that we've provided, and you can just print out the page that has the letter you want to use on it. So next step, you can cut out the outline of the rectangle that your letter is in, and then you can take some of the cardstock and cut that down as well. So I've cut these to the same size, which is roughly 5 by 7. So the next thing I want to do is just secure this template to the cardstock so it doesn't move around while I'm tracing it. So I'm using washi tape because it is removable. You could also use some other sort of repositionable tape. So I'm just going to line that up and then just wrap it around the edge here. So I find it sufficient to just do one side, and I actually sometimes like the freedom to kind of peek underneath to see how it's going as I'm tracing it. So next I'm going to trace my P onto this cardstock behind it. And instead of using a pen or pencil, I'm using this bone folder. So I'm basically just creating an indentation that I can follow along, and then it's nice because you don't have to worry about any pencil or pen marks. If you don't have a bone folder, you could use something else that's just got a similar shape. Maybe it's a pen cap or something along those lines. And you're just going to run your bone folder along the outline. And you can kind of take a peek and see if you need to go over more than once, which I think I do. Okay, so let's take a look. See if I can see that. So if there's any spots that are a little fainter that you want to reinforce, which I think maybe here and here I might go over one more time, you can go ahead and do that. Just want to make sure it's still lined up. And then I think I'm ready to go. So now I went ahead and removed my template, and I just have my outline there to follow along. A little tricky to see in the lighting, but it's plenty dark enough for me to be able to follow along to create my edge work, and I don't have to worry about erasing any lines. All right, so now I'm ready to get started. I've got my background with the P traced on it. I have all my gluing supplies, so the glue, my little glue template, and the card to spread the glue with, some scissors, some tweezers, and then the paper itself. So we're just doing straight edges for the most part with only slight curves, so you don't need the quilling tool for this step. So the way you determine where to fold your paper to follow the outline is really easy to do. You can just lay your first strip down along the edge there, and then when you get to a corner, that's where you can pinch it to fold it. So I'm going to go ahead, fold that. I'm going to just double check. That looks pretty good. And then you're just going to keep working your way around and folding it accordingly. So I'm lining up with this corner now, and then I'm just making a kind of line with my nail there. You could also use your quilling tool to help you kind of mark where things will get folded. And then I'm going to follow around. So I have to hold this in place, and I'm going to just kind of keep moving around, holding it as I go until I get there. Go ahead and pinch it. And I'm making sure to line up the edges when I do these folds so everything lays flush with the paper. And then this is my last stretch here. And so this part I'm actually going to cut because I'm back to where I started. So we'll line that up. I'm just going to mark it with my thumbnail first and then trim. So let's double check this. Oops. All right, looks pretty good. Of course, we'll have to move that around when we're gluing. We'll get that to stay in place. So then I just have to repeat that for the interior here. So this time I'm just really going to have one crease. Then I need to estimate where to cut it. I think right about there. All right, so I just needed one strip to do that outline, so I can put this extra one aside. And now it's time to start gluing. So now it's time to start gluing. Before I glue my pieces down, wherever there's curves, it helps to shape it a little bit beforehand so that it matches that curve more easily when you're gluing it down. So I'm just going to form it a little bit with my fingers so that it doesn't fight me once it's covered in glue. So this is a slightly boxy curve. So it's almost like there's rounded corners here. And again, you don't have to exactly match that outline. It's going to kind of disappear once you start laying things down, but it helps to get as close as you can. So let's see. Just push that a little bit. All right, I'm going to start with that piece and then I'll shape this one in a bit. So I have some glue on here already, but I think some of it may be drying up, so I'm going to reapply some glue. I'm going a little heavier on this to make sure that it really gets picked up by the edges. And you can use your tweezers or your fingers, whatever's easier for you. I kind of end up using both. I like to pick it up with the tweezers, but then I typically end up shaping it with my fingers. So I'm going to go ahead and start on that straight edge. And then I kind of hold it in place for a little bit to get it to set. So then we have just this little corner here where we want two pieces to meet. So that's where I take a little scrap. Get a bigger piece here. So I just take an extra scrap here and get glue on one side and then determine what edge I think I'm going to put it on. So I think I'm going to slide it along here. And then I glue the corners together that way. And as you continue to work through the whole piece, you might notice something didn't quite stick the way you expected, so you can kind of go through at the end and reinforce any areas that still need a little more glue. And then if there's any edges that aren't sticking to the paper, you can reinforce it with more glue the same way with a little scrap of paper. All right, so let's do the outside edge. So this can be a lot to manage all at once to glue. So you can actually cut this down into smaller pieces to make it more manageable. So I think that's what I'll do here. If you'd rather glue it all at once, you can definitely go for it. And if you miss spots, you can kind of go back in and reapply the glue. So I'm going to start with this piece here. It's nice and easy, no curves. Again, I'm just checking the shape of it. Just the more you can, whoops, the more you can shape it ahead, the easier it is to glue. So just trying to get that at a good 90-degree angle, and I'll let the glue do the rest. Oops. I usually drop it a couple times in the glue, and if you see kind of a blank spot where the paper was, you know that you're picking it up, so that's a good sign. You can see it's a little easier to glue things that aren't on a curve. All right, so we've got this long side, whoops, and then the curve. So I think I'm going to cut this as well. Oops. Looks good. And I'm kind of holding one side and then pulling the length of it as straight as I can. And if you ever go long on any of these, you can always go back in and snip it with scissors. So it's almost better for it to be the paper to be too long than too short, although you can always fill in, but it just might not look as clean. All right, last shape, or last side. Now for this curve, so kind of like before, I'm gonna just bend the paper a little bit more to reflect the curve, so that I don't have to deal with that when it's wet with glue. The glue dries pretty quickly, and so then you'll find that it's not sticking anymore if you're trying to shape it while the glue is on there. And it looks like I have a little extra paper here, potentially. So I might trim it a smidge. Trying to make sure that's a right angle so that it's easy to glue the pieces together. All right, I think that looks good. So this is a long curved piece, so sometimes it's challenging to glue the whole thing at once. So you could just get glue on part of it, get it down, and then retouch the remaining piece with a little scrap of paper. Or you could go for it all at once as well. I'll show you the first way of just getting part of it covered in glue and then gluing the rest with the scrap of paper. So I'm just letting this kind of hang off the edge a bit, so the entire thing isn't covered in glue. So in this case, I don't have to worry about this little strip kind of getting glue onto the background or getting stuck where I don't want it. If you do get some glue on your background, you can let it dry and you can go in with a little eraser, or even you can sometimes scratch it off with the pointy end of your quilling tool as well. Just do it gently so it doesn't scratch up the paper too much. Okay, so now I'm going to take, I think this is pretty secure. I'm going to go ahead and run this through the glue. And then just apply it underneath there. And then I need to do a little bit more for the very end. So now we've got our edge work for our P, and the last thing I need to do is just go in any corners that are not attached and add a little glue there. And if you need to trim, like this spot's a little high, I'll trim that as well. I'm gonna get a fresh scrap here. And there you have it. Your edge work is complete. So now it's time to start filling it with quilled designs. Now it's time to fill in the edge work. So I've created a few different scrolls and a coil here. And I went with a warm color palette with a range of yellows and oranges. So you can have fun picking out what your color palette's gonna be, make some of your favorite shapes. And I usually like to get a few started and then start placing them inside my letter, and then I can adjust as needed. And I do think it helps to kind of map things out ahead, just placing these in here before gluing them down so that you can have an idea of the direction of your design ahead of time. And then you have a better idea once you start gluing of what you're gonna do. So I'm just gonna slide these in here. I tend to favor scrolls personally. I just love how fluid they look, but you can use whatever shapes you want. Let's see. I think I'll put that right about there. I'm just gonna set some of these on here too and not worry about sliding them all together. Oops. And the thing that you'll find you may need to do as you're dropping things in here is maybe curve them with your fingers or with a bone folder so they can all nestle into each other. So I think I'll put that about there. And then this one, I think I will put in here, but have it popping outside the edge of this P. So I'm just going to lay this here for now. Oops. And I think that's roughly how I'll line everything up. And you can just kind of adjust as you go as well. So I'm going to go ahead and pull some of these out. All right, I'm going to make sure that I have a somewhat thick layer of this glue so that it really coats the edges of each piece of paper. I'm going to start in the bottom corner here and work my way up. And remember, you might have to kind of loosen up the different layers before pulling that up so it doesn't twist your shape. So I'm going to start with this coil, and then I'm going to do this same side scroll next. I'm going to try curving this a little bit with my hands in my bone folder, just so it maybe slightly wraps around the coil that I just dropped in there. And oops, I got a little glue on there. I like to lead with the end that I really want to make sure lines up with something specific, so I'm kind of starting with this bottom part because I want it to make sure it touches the bottom of the P, and then I move on to the other parts of the coil, or scroll in this case. Okay, so I think I will put this in next because it's going to come down the lowest of all of those shapes. I'm just going to go in at an angle and move that out of the way. Sometimes you have to adjust a little bit as you go, as things really kind of get set in there and take shape. So sometimes you trim something, maybe coil it a little tighter. In this case, I'm going to just change this curve a little bit so it aligns with the other pieces that are in there already. So I'm just going to test this out. See how that looks. All right. Again, I'm kind of going in at an angle with this one just so I can aim it. And then I'm pressing down once I'm happy with the position. All right. Let's see. I think I had this one roughly over here. And then I think I had this one here. So I'm just double checking myself to make sure everything's fitting. I think I'll change the curve on this one a little bit. So I'm going to actually put in the darker orange one first, because that's a really snug fit. I'm going to kind of stretch this one out as I'm putting it in. So you can really still continue to play with the shape as you're gluing it down. So I'm going to trim this one a little bit shorter. See how that looks. Here, that seems to fit a little bit better. And then this one I'll have coming out from the middle of those two, so I think I can trim that one shorter as well. But I'm going to attach this one first before I cut anything, because once I glue it down, the position may be slightly different. So I don't want to trim that other one ahead of time. I'm getting to the point where I probably need to start adding some more glue to this palette, but I think I've got enough to go off of for this piece. All right, so since I just have one more piece, I don't think I'm gonna add more glue to that palette. I think I can make it last. But now I'm gonna go ahead and trim this. So I want to have this extend past the border. And I'll probably have it start right about here. So I'm going to trim that. I'm going to adjust the curve of this a little bit. So I'm gonna actually trim this into two pieces. So I'm determining kind of where I want it to disrupt that border. I'm kind of marking that spot and then snipping it. So it'll drop in about here. And then I'll pick it up on the other side like that. So I'm actually gluing in two pieces separately and creating the illusion that it's one. So a fun little quilling trick. So I want to make sure this hits the border. It's part of the illusion that's important, is that it actually touches. And same with this piece, I want to make sure it touches on the same spot on the other side. There you have it. That's my last piece. And I can go ahead and go in with a little strip of paper and glue these to the sides of the pea as well. And you could keep going. You could keep adding to your design and make it really full, or you could keep it simple like this. Really, that's part of the fun, is just designing and creating. And then you could also frame this, or you could add a little paper backing like I did here when you frame it, just to give it an extra pop of color. Quilling is a really beautiful technique for making handmade stationery, and I especially love making florals. These are two examples here that I've made. This one here shows a little bit more of those classic quilled shapes. With this one, everything started with a coil, and then I shaped them with my fingers into petals and leaves. With this one here, it's a little bit more organic and a little bit more edge work done. And I mostly shaped these with my hands. I just used the quilling tool for the center. So I'm going to show you how I made this one step by step. But I would encourage you to just have fun designing your own and creating your own floral designs on stationery. I'm showing these with envelopes. When you use the really thin quilling strips, they should be able to fit into an envelope. But if you're worried about something getting crushed in the mail, these A7 mailer boxes are a great way to send something and protect it from getting damaged in the mail. So one of the things I really love about quilling is the really organic, fluid edge work. So I'm going to show you an example of a design that focuses on that. And I've picked out different shades of yellow and green for my floral, but you can do whatever colors you want. So I'm going to start with just showing you how to make a single petal. And I've got a full strip here. I probably won't need to use the whole thing, but we'll get started and then trim as needed. So what I do here is I start by creating a series of teardrop shapes. So I'm just going to create it so it's roughly, you know, from my knuckle to the tip of my finger. So that's about an inch. And what I'm going to do when I get to the point of the teardrop is fold back and pinch there. I'm always holding on to the to the pointy end of the teardrop. And I'm going to go back up and loop back around again. And I'm not worrying about anything being really exact on the rounded end of the teardrop. We're going to kind of shape things afterwards. And I kind of like the kind of the organic feel to this, so I'm okay with it not being precise. So then once I get to the pointy end of the teardrop again, once again I'm going to fold back and layer another teardrop shape. And you could do 3 teardrops, you could do 4 teardrops. You can really play around with how many you want to do. I'm going to do just 3 here. So still gripping this, I'm going to take the excess paper and then wrap it around that pointy end of the teardrop and then around the rounded ends of the teardrops. And so you can leave a little gap here, or you can pull it more snug. I'm going to do it about like that. So then what I need to do is trim this end. So I'm just going to change my grip so I can cut this with scissors. So I'm just going to cut at the very end here, so there's no extra sticking over. And I'm just going to glue this last little piece here. So the inner layers are still loose in there. So it is possible if you kind of handle it wrong that they might pop out. You can just slide them back in, it's no big deal. I like leaving them loose in there because when I assemble the flower, I like to be able to flex the petals and change the shapes if I want to. So it helps to not have each little layer glued together. And it's also a little easier to have to do less gluing. So there is a single petal for my flower. So I've created 8 total petals for my flower. And I like it to look really full without gaps in between petals. So that's why I did a lot. If you like it to be a little airier with gaps between your petals, you could do fewer. I could just glue them together like this, meeting in the center, but you can also create a center separately by creating a coil. So I'm just going to do that with this one and kind of slide that in the middle. So I want the center to be pretty small. So I'm just going to roll this tightly. And I'm not going to let it release too much when I slide it off the end of my quilling tool so that the coils stay really tight. And this is not a full strip. It's a little bit shorter. So there you have it. You could do it even smaller if you wanted to remove some of that. Or you could just start with a shorter length to begin with, but I'm gonna go ahead and cut some of this off. And then glue that together. And I'm just holding it pretty firmly the whole time so that it doesn't uncoil. So before we start gluing and assembling the petals, I'm going to make a couple of leaves so we can see the whole thing together. Oops. All right, there is my center. I'm just going to pop this in here, roughly in the center. And now I'm going to start the leaves. So I'm going to do a 2-tone leaf where the center is a little darker and the exterior is a little lighter. It's kind of like a way to mimic the look of veins in a leaf in a very simplified way. So again, I'm going to just do some folding with my fingers, although this time I'm going to start with roughly a teardrop shape, but I'm going to keep wrapping around instead of reversing the fold. I'm just going to keep wrapping it and just make it slightly bigger with each layer. I'm just going to do 3 layers. And then I'm going to snip that and glue it together. It is a snowy day here today, so you can probably hear cars driving through all the slush outside. It's a good day to be inside crafting. Okay, so now I have my interior glued together, and I'm gonna now pick up my more kind of lighter minty green, and I'm gonna actually glue this onto the piece I just created. And I'm going to start at this pointy end, line that up. And then I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to keep wrapping around, a little bit bigger for each layer. And I'm going to go around 3 times. Again, there's no rules here on how many layers you're doing. Totally up to you. I feel like 3 is a good number. So that's what I'm going to do. Right, and I'm going to snip this and glue it down. So then what you can do is shape this with your fingers however you like. I'm going to start by smoothing that out to create kind of a pointed shape, but then like give it a little breathing room there. You can even give it a little more of a curve, curvy leaf shape. So however you want your leaves to look, you can kind of shape them. And then I'm going to make 1 more leaf. Okay, so now I have all the pieces really. I have my petals, my leaves, and this will be my stem that I drop in at the very end. So I'm going to get everything lined up, and I'm also going to shape the petals. So I think I need to move this up a little bit. So I'll be placing it somewhere up there. And then I mentioned creating an organic look. So you could leave the petals looking just like that, a little bit more like pretty neat teardrop shape. I like to play around with creating a little more organic look by just simply shaping them a little bit with my hands. And I'm just kind of allowing some of them to kind of fan out a little bit. Some of them I might leave a little thinner, but I'm changing the outside shape a touch, but I'm also changing the interior and the way each little piece of paper kind of moves within the petal. So I mentioned I really am drawn to the kind of organic fluid edge work. And a lot of times when you see that edge work, it's all placed in like piece by piece, which takes a lot of time and patience. And I like having this shortcut of creating kind of these little teardrop loops that allow me to create edge work in fewer steps, basically. That one looks a little funny. And some of them might end up looking a little funny, but once you start putting them together, it all makes sense. And I'm also looking at, you know, the shape of petals, how they kind of fit in next to each other. So I might need some to be a little wider at the bottom because of the gaps I'm creating. So that's where it helps to not have this glued down. I can kind of push on the bottom like I did there to actually make it wider. And it's okay if there's little gaps in the middle. You don't have to have that all filled in. All right, last one. Whoops. All right, so that is roughly the shape of my flower. And as we glue it down, we can also kind of glue it in a way that shapes it a little bit too. So I'm going to glue my petals down first. I think ultimately my flower is going to be kind of leaning a little bit like this with the leaves a little off to the side, and then I'll have the stem kind of curving up. So I have this a little bit off to the side instead of centered. So now that I've got everything roughly in position, I'm going to glue it all down. So I'm going to start with my center. So that's kind of the anchor of this. Everything will come out from the center. Oops. Sometimes these can get in the way a little bit when you're gluing, but I prefer having them roughly in position because I tend to forget where I had everything lined up once I pull it away. Keep in mind as you're gluing that the tip of your teardrop shape on the petals is not totally glued together. So you just want to lift it out carefully so that you don't pull everything apart. That said, if anything comes apart, it's very easy to just pop it back together again. So I tend to glue everything in order, like I just kind of keep working my way around. But I do keep my eye on the flower as a whole in case I may be filling up the space a little bit differently than I first did when I laid it out. So you don't want to have an awkward gap on one side. So I just kind of keep checking myself and adjusting as needed. I'm going to move my leaves aside for now. You can see I can sometimes shape things a little bit when I'm gluing. And you can turn the card to make it easier to fill everything up and glue it down. So this is an example of, as I'm gluing it down, I can see that things are, oops, I have a little glue on my thumb, are moving a bit. So I might end up making this one a little bit more slender so that everything fits in. So I'm just going to lead in with that point and then press on this side to change the shape a little bit. And let's see how that works. There, now everything's fitting pretty well. I'm going to switch to this side and just fill in from there. And then this is my last petal. All right, so next I do my leaves. Like I think I mentioned, I save my stem for last. Kind of use it to connect the dots, so to speak. So I'm just going to position my leaves. And you could have them meeting at the bottom, or you could maybe do them a little bit more asymmetrically like that. You just want to make sure they're close enough together that the stem will be able to touch both of them. So the easiest way to make sure that that's happening is that you actually touch the leaves together. All right, so last step is my stem. So first I'm going to kind of place it in here and figure out where I need to cut it. I'm going to cut it a little bit longer than I think I need to, because you can always trim more. And then just next is decide what kind of curve you want. I think I want it to curve a little bit more like that. And then I'll trim just a tiny bit more. And I think I'm good to go. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of hold on to this with my tweezers. And I'm going to start by making sure the one end is touching those leaves. And then I'm going to guide it, whoops. And I'm going to guide it into the petals. And press down. And there you have it, a piece of floral stationery. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned a lot, and we'll continue to have fun exploring with quilling. If you post any of your creations to Instagram, please share with us by hashtagging PaperSource, and we'll see you next time.